Two words framed in cheap wood have hung on a Texas kitchen wall since 1959. And for 4 decades, the woman who owned that frame refused to tell a single visitor who made those 2 words possible. She let people guess. She let them assume a rich uncle, a lucky oil strike, anything but the truth. Here's what actually happened on a courthouse square outside a half-built movie set in the Texas brush country, and why the man responsible spent the rest of his life pretending it never happened at all. Late summer, 1959, Kinney County, Texas, a stretch of scrub and limestone west of Brackettville, where cattle outnumber people by a wide margin. A working ranch sits at the end of a dirt lane, 420 acres that had passed through one family since before either World War touched this country. The house was built from local stone by hand. The barn leaned a little on its east side from 50 years of wind, and the woman standing in the yard that August watching 2 men from a Del Rio bank walk her fence line with a clipboard was about to become the latest name in a story that plays out on ranches all over the West when the rain doesn't come and the market turns and a good man dies too soon. Her name was Nora. She'd married into this land back when Roosevelt was still a governor, not a president, and she'd spent nearly 30 years learning every inch of it the way you learn a person you love. She knew which fence post needed replacing before it snapped. She knew the exact week the bluebonnets would come up on the south slope. Her husband, Sam, had inherited the place from his father, who'd broken the ground originally with nothing but stubbornness and a mule. Sam had gone to Italy during the war, come back with a heart weakened by something the doctors couldn't quite name, and spent the next decade running cattle anyway, because that was the only life he understood. 2 straight years of drought-cheap beef prices had bled the operation dry before Sam ever got sick. When the well on the north end finally gave out, he did what half the ranchers in that county had already done. He walked into the bank and mortgaged the land itself to pay for a new one. $8,000, borrowed against everything his family had built across 3 generations. He had a plan to pay it back over a few good seasons. He got exactly 1 decent season before his heart gave out on him in the saddle, on an ordinary October afternoon, leaving Nora holding a note that didn't care whether its signer was alive to keep paying it. She tried. God, she tried. She sold what she could sell. She took in mending. She stretched every dollar until it was translucent. But a widow with 1 grown son and a debt that size against a shrinking cattle market was fighting a battle that arithmetic alone was going to lose. The bank sent letters. Then the letters stopped, and a man in a gray suit showed up in her yard instead, carrying a leather ledger and an apology that wasn't really an apology. He told her the county would auction the ranch off the courthouse steps in Brackettville on the 2nd Tuesday of September, and then he handed her a printed notice and drove away, the dust from his sedan hanging in the air long after the sound of the engine had faded. Nora didn't fall apart in front of him. She waited until she couldn't hear his tires on the gravel anymore, and then she sat down on the porch steps her husband used to sit on every evening, and she let herself feel exactly how much this was going to cost her. Here's the part of this story most people never hear about, because it happened 40 miles away and had nothing to do with banks or ledgers at all. At almost the exact same moment, Nora was packing dishes into cardboard boxes. An entire frontier fort was rising out of the same stretch of Texas dirt. John Wayne had sunk a staggering portion of his own fortune into building a nearly full-scale replica of the Alamo on a ranch outside Brackettville, planning to direct and star in the picture himself. It took roughly 2 years and hundreds of local laborers to construct. Men hauling adobe brick, mixing mortar, raising walls under a sun that didn't care about anybody's shooting schedule. One of those laborers was a 16-year-old named Cole. Quiet kid, strong back, the kind of worker a foreman doesn't think twice about because he never causes a single problem. Every single Friday, Cole took his pay, a few dollars for a brutal week of physical labor, and walked it straight home to put in his mother's hands. He never mentioned how the heat had started dropping grown men that summer. He never mentioned how tired he was. He'd decided, somewhere in that stubborn 16-year-old brain of his, that his job now was to be one less thing his mother had to worry about. So he simply didn't let her see the cost. Cole was Nora's son. The Friday before the auction, he didn't show up for work. He didn't show up Monday either. When Wayne, who apparently made a habit of noticing which of his workers never complained, asked where the kid had gone, the answer came back through the foreman in a few flat sentences. family lost their ranch to the bank. Sales set for Tuesday over in Kinney County. Boy went home to help his mother pack out whatever they could carry. Wayne didn't say much in response. He just stood there a moment in the shadow of a half-finished adobe wall, thinking about the fact that he'd spent 2 years and most of his own money building a monument to men who refused to surrender everything they had. And 40 miles from that monument, a widow was about to lose everything, and the kid who'd been hauling his water the entire time had never said one word about it. He asked a single follow-up question. What time is the sale and where? Then he went back to work like nothing had happened, and he didn't bring it up again for the rest of the weekend. But people who worked with Wayne over the years say the same thing about him. The man could be building a wall with his hands and reorganizing his whole world in his head at the same time. On Saturday night, he drove back to where he was staying and made one phone call to a bank in San Antonio. He told them to have a substantial amount of cash ready for him by Tuesday morning. He didn't explain the reason. It was his money, and this happened to be the year he could least afford to spend it recklessly, which apparently didn't factor into his decision at all. Tuesday arrived hot. The kind of Texas September morning where the light comes down flat and unforgiving. Word travels fast in a small county, and by 9 a.m. the Brackettville Courthouse Square had filled with neighbors, ranch families in their cleanest shirts, standing quietly with their hats off. There because that's simply what you do when someone in your community is about to lose their home. Not one of them intended to bid. Around there, you don't bid against a widow for her own land. It isn't written down anywhere. It's just understood. An older rancher stood near the front, turning his hat over in his hands. He was the man who had carried Sam's body out of that field 3 years earlier, the day his heart stopped in the saddle. If he'd had the money, he'd have bought the ranch back himself, just to hand it to Nora free and clear. He didn't have the money. Nobody standing on those steps did. That was the particular cruelty baked into mornings like this one. An entire community can genuinely love a family and still stand there completely powerless to stop the thing happening right in front of them. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Lloyd in a rumpled suit, had cried 100 sales like this one, and this one clearly sat wrong with him. He read off the legal description in a voice stripped of any feeling. 420 acres, stone house, barn, both wells, deed clear except for the outstanding note. Nora stood at the edge of the steps, wrapped in a coat too big for her. Cole beside her with his jaw locked tight, doing his level best to look like a man instead of a scared teenager. Neither of them looked at the crowd. They stared at the dirt, also present that morning. A well-dressed stranger from San Antonio, cigar clenched in his teeth, gold ring flashing every time he moved his hand. A land speculator. He'd done his homework. He knew the bank only cared about recovering its $8,000 and would let the property go the moment a bid cleared that number, and he intended to pay just barely enough to clear it and not a cent more, then carve the ranch into parcels and flip them for a tidy profit within a year. The bidding opened. Silence answered it. Then the speculator, almost bored, tossed out $5,000, a number below the actual debt, a calculated insult meant to signal that he already knew he'd won and everyone else could go home. The auctioneer's jaw tightened, but a bid is a bid, and the bank would rather take a small loss than take nothing at all. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd, not loud, not urgent, just certain. 10,000. Every head turned. Leaning against the fender of a dusty car at the edge of the square stood a tall man in a tan jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, one boot propped against the running board, looking for all the world like a man waiting for a bus rather than a man about to change somebody's entire life. He hadn't pushed through the crowd. He hadn't raised his hand. He'd simply set a number into the morning air and let it do the work. Cole's head snapped up. He recognized that voice immediately. He'd hauled water past that exact man for 2 years straight. The speculator squinted, didn't place him at first, and snapped back, with something about this being a real sale, not a place to play games. Wayne, still leaning against his car like the whole thing bored him slightly, simply said he was bidding. The speculator stung, and now performing for an audience that had started watching him rather than the widow, pushed to 11. Then Wayne answered with 12 without straightening up off the fender. Then 13 came back sharper, and Wayne let a beat of silence pass before he said $15,000. $15,000 for a piece of Kinney County brush country, worth roughly half that on paper. There was no business logic left anywhere in that number. There was only a man who had quietly decided, sometime over the weekend, that this particular outcome simply wasn't going to happen on his watch. And the speculator, sharp suit, cigar, gold ring and all, could see it plainly. Whatever profit he'd come chasing had evaporated the moment somebody showed up willing to lose money to win. He pulled the cigar from his mouth, looked once at the crowd looking at him, looked once at the widow, and something in his posture just gave way. He muttered that it was Wayne's turn and walked back to his own car without another word. The auctioneer let the gavel hang in the air a long moment before he brought it down. Sold, to the gentleman at the back. Nobody in that crowd moved right away. They'd shown up expecting to witness a funeral, and instead, they'd just watched it turn into something else entirely. And there wasn't a ready word for that particular feeling. Somewhere near the steps, a woman started crying quietly. The specific kind of crying that only happens when something you'd already grieved as loss turns out, against every reasonable expectation, not to be lost after all. Wayne crossed the square unhurried, and the crowd parted for him without anyone asking them to. At the folding table where the bank's representative sat with his ledger, Wayne reached inside his jacket and produced a thick envelope of cash. He counted it out onto the wooden table in full view of everyone. Stacks of $100 bills, more currency than most people standing on that square had ever seen change hands in one place. He counted straight past the $8,000 owed and kept going, all the way to the full $15,000 he'd bid, then slid the $7,000 difference back across the table with instructions. Clear the note, stamp it paid, and put whatever remained toward the widow's account for next year's taxes and seed. The banksman looked up from his ledger, genuinely startled, and pointed out that the debt was only $8,000. Wayne had just handed over nearly double. Wayne's answer was short. He knew exactly what he'd paid. Then he turned to the auctioneer and said, loud enough for the whole square to catch it, that the deed was to be drawn in Nora's name, today, before he left the county. Understand what he was giving up here. He could have simply let the ranch go to the highest reasonable bidder and walked away without spending a dime of his own increasingly stretched fortune. Instead, at the exact moment his own finances were tied up in an enormous gamble on a movie about men who refused to give ground, he stood at a folding table in the Texas heat and handed a widow he'd never formally met a property worth nearly double what he paid for it, then gave it away entirely. Nora came down off the steps, not quite able to process what had just happened. She told him she couldn't accept this, that she had no way to ever repay a debt like this one. Wayne told her it wasn't a loan. When she said she didn't even know how to properly thank him, he looked past her toward Cole, sunburned, dust-covered, the same quiet kid who'd hauled his water for 2 years and never once mentioned that his family was drowning, and said the boy had been showing up to work every single day without complaint, and that was thanks enough already. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether her husband had raised the boy. She told him his father had, before the war sent him overseas, and a weakened heart eventually brought him home to finish the job. Wayne went quiet a moment at that, then said something that Cole would carry with him the rest of his life, that Sam had already paid for this land once, and Wayne was simply settling the rest of his account. He never gave his name. He touched the brim of his hat toward Nora, rested a hand once on Cole's shoulder, and walked back across the square to his car, leaving it to the auctioneer to finally tell the stunned crowd exactly who they'd just watched hand over $15,000 for a stranger's cattle ranch. Cole went back to the Alamo set the very next morning and finished out the build like nothing extraordinary had happened. He stood in that crowd months later when the massive set finally stood complete, a frontier town raised out of nothing in the middle of the brush. He never told a single co-worker what the man who employed them had done for his family. Some things, he decided, simply weren't meant to be spoken about out loud. They were meant to be carried quietly instead. Years later, as an old man himself, Cole told this story exactly once, to his own grandson, sitting on that very same porch step where his mother had once broken down with her face in her hands. And the detail he kept coming back to wasn't the money at all. It was the fact that the biggest, most famous man he'd ever stood next to had never once bothered to stand up straight off that car fender the entire time he was saving his family's home. Like rescuing a widow from ruin required about as much effort as ordering a cup of coffee, and then he'd simply gone back to work. Nora ran cattle on that ranch for another 26 years. When her body finally couldn't manage it anymore, Cole took over, and eventually his own children after him. The well that had started the entire crisis still produces water to this day. The stone house still stands at the end of that same dirt lane. And not far away, the Alamo replica John Wayne built out of adobe and stubbornness still stands too, the only full-scale version of its kind, a monument constructed for a film that ended up outlasting nearly everyone who built it. In that kitchen, two frames still hang side by side. One holds the original banknote for $8,000. The paper gone brittle and yellow with age, stamped across the front in fading red ink with 3 words, "Paid in full." The other holds a photograph from the fall of 1959, a sunburned teenage boy standing in the dust beside a tall man in a wide hat, half-finished adobe walls rising behind them both, neither one looking anywhere near the camera. They're both looking at the wall they're building. If a story like this one landed with you, send it to someone who once held onto a home when everyone around them said to let it go. A widow, a veteran, anybody who's ever fought that particular fight. And if you're new around here, hit that subscribe button because there are plenty more stories like this one still to come.